So the Cartel de Gauche comes to power under Edouard Herriot in 1924. As you can see here from the caption, his time in power is actually only relatively brief. And as we will discuss in a few moments, on the domestic scene, the Cartel de Gauche don't have an enormous amount of success. But the one bright spot of the Cartel de Gauche in its years in power came in foreign policy, especially under the guidance of the French Foreign Minister, Aristide Briand, who had served as the Prime Minister in an earlier decade. Herriot and Briand basically came to a conclusion, and in some ways following on from the sympathy in the French left for the kind of harsh peace imposed on Germany after the war, that the best way to guarantee French security would be to work with the Germans and collaborate on some issues of common interest, as opposed to trying to browbeat the Germans into paying for the cost of the war. I mean, not that they were saying necessarily abandoning that the French or Germans had to pay for the war, but the aggressive approach of the French government up until this point had not necessarily served to improve France's security. They were helped in this matter by the fact that the German foreign minister, a guy called Gustav Stresemann, was of a like mind. He believed that there was considerable room for collaboration and cooperation between the French and the Germans. And in 1925, Stresemann had proposed that the French and Germans come together and basically negotiate an acceptance of the border between them. This became known as the Locarno Pact. So pictured here we have Briand on the right. On the left we have Stresemann, and the man in the middle is Austen Chamberlain, who is the British Foreign Secretary. And essentially what they were agreeing was that the difference between the Locarno Pact and the Treaty of Versailles ultimately was one of symbolism, that this was something that the Germans and French negotiated together, as opposed to being a peace that was dictated to the Germans. And they basically agreed to recognize one another's borders on the Western Front, no longer to kind of promote territorial claims between each other. However, what was of interest, and we'll talk about this again in a later lecture, was that the German government refused to recognize the boundaries of the new Eastern European countries. And that was significant because many of these countries, like Czechoslovakia, like Poland, were at this time actually French allies. So we'll come back to that at a later date. But the main point is that the Locarno Pact marked a new chapter in kind of more positive relations between the French and Germans. Although, as you can see this cartoon here, kind of more cynical view of the Locarno Pact being that, well, there's a certain amount of peace, but obviously France, the military might still lay in the French corner, that the Germans were not kind of necessarily equals to the French in terms of their military capabilities. Briand became a symbol for helped bring France, I guess, make France the leading nation advocating peace over the course of the 1920s. Perhaps the most famous example of this came with the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which effectively outlawed war. And the idea was that all countries that signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact agreed to never again use war as a weapon of diplomacy. You can see Germany signed it, the United States signed it, France signed it. Obviously, we know in the long run, the Kellogg-Briand Pact didn't stop war, unfortunately. But it kind of helped reinforce Briand's image as an international peace dealer, an agent of peace in that sense. There's a satirical cartoon here. We see Briand again on the right, and the baby in the carriage, League of Nations, kind of calling out to the United States, Papa, kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment on the United States being the ones that originally promoted the idea of League of Nations and collaborative peace, and then withdrawing from the European scene and leaving it to, in many ways, to the French to take the lead or to fill that void in leadership had been left by the United States. So, domestically, the Cartel de Gauche and Briand in particular had some success. However, at home, things were not quite so smooth. Inflation continued to be a major problem in France. I mentioned earlier on there was a run on the franc in 1923 that had forced the French to end their occupation of the Ruhr. And once Edouard Herriot came to power as the leader of the Cartel de Gauche, he found his kind of ability to confront the French economic crisis stymied. Firstly, the Socialist Party, while they agreed to kind of nominally support the Herriot's radical Republican government, they were not officially part of the government and therefore could withdraw their support at any time. And that was maintaining a long-held socialist position that not to directly be involved in any government that they couldn't run themselves. Ariat also kind of aggravated. So basically, what was the solution to the financial crisis? The Socialist Party wanted to tax the wealthy, and use it. Essentially, that was their resolution to solving France's financial problems. The problem was the radical Republicans who supported Ariat tended to be, many of them were wealthy, many of them were business owners or landowners, and that policy was unacceptable. So Ariat's hands were somewhat tied in terms of taking effective measures to deal with the growing inflation crisis in France and the weakness of the currency. Additionally, Ariat had aggravated Catholic opinions on his government. So during the period of the Bloc National from 1919 to 1924, many of the issues between the French state and Catholicism had been resolved. The French state had effectively agreed to re-establish connections with the Vatican and had kind of settled the issue. But Ariat had proposed possibly taking new measures to counteract Catholicism in French society, and so made enemies in that sense as well. And really, Ariat only survived in power for 1 year. There was then a period of instability from 1925 1926. Ariat briefly returned, but France and the Third Republic was kind of getting a bit listless and leaderless at a time of significant crisis. And this opened the door to at least some on the fringe of the right, some activist groups who wanted to kind of abandon democratic government in its entirety. One of these groups, which we came across before, was Action Française, established in 1899 by Charles Maurras, which we've come across that before, but that was an older group. There was new groups emerging that had kind of similar kind of fascist tendencies. I guess I've given away the answer to my question here. From the Latin for bundle, this axe protruding from a bundle of rods was intended to symbolize strength. What is fasces? That was a symbol of fascism. It was originally Mussolini's symbol, but you see this guy Georges Valois here established in the mid-1920s La Fascu, the fascist, using that there is the fascist symbol on your screen, and trying to kind of present himself as something of a French Mussolini. And he wasn't the only one. Another new group established, the Jeunesse Patriotes, the Young Patriots, similarly echoed Mussolini's black shirts, in particular their kind of militarism, their willingness to wear shirts or uniforms and march on the streets and confront their political enemies. So now it has to be said, in the 1920s, these groups only attracted minor political support, but it was a sign, I guess, of the growing discontent on the right towards organised government, democratic parliamentary government in France. There was also divisions on the left. Essentially, starting in the mid-1920s, Joseph Stalin had ordered the French Communist Party to cease any kind of collaboration with the Socialist Party. The idea essentially being that by collaborating with the Socialist Party, Stalin believed the French Communist Party were helping that party to exist. And so by refusing to cooperate them, the idea would be that left-leaning voters have no choice but to either choose the Communist Party or choose the Socialist Party, and he assumed they would choose the Communist Party. So the Communist Party became more isolated diplomatically or politically in France in this time period. They also adopted unpopular policies such as protesting against the suppression of a rebellion in Morocco, kind of very much against the traditional view of French amongst French people that Morocco was a colony and repression of rebellion was justified. But what the decision of the Communist Party kind of weakened the left wing in France, because now the communists were basically saying that they would offer no political support, especially in French elections. There was often 2 rounds of elections, and what the Communist Party said was, under no circumstances would we allow any of our votes to transfer to the Socialist Party. So the political left remained somewhat divided as a result of this. And because of the lack of leadership in France, there was, like I said, a continuing financial crisis. The franc again, a run began on the franc again in 1926. That caused an escalating financial crisis. The government was forced to borrow large amounts of money to compensate for, or in order to try and stabilize the franc, borrowing more money to offset the run on the franc. And what there was a desperate need for was some return to political normalcy, a hero, if you will. Yes, so France needed a hero, someone to emerge and help restore confidence in the French economy. And there was no one better placed than a gentleman we've encountered several times already, Raymond Poincaré, the former president and former prime minister of France. He was able to, in the wake of the fall of Hériot's government in 1926, or essentially Hériot's inability to reorganized the French government in 1926, Poincaré emerged from a coalition of right-wing and moderate forces to become prime minister again. And he was widely admired in France as the person who had firstly rescued the franc in 1924 and therefore was best positioned to help save it again in 1926. He adopted some sensible measures, introduced a new tax to help offset the burgeoning debt of the French government, trimmed back the cost of some of the French government's expenditure, and also fixed the rate of the franc in 1928 to the gold standard. The great hope in France was that the value of the franc could return to what it had been in 1914. We live in an age today of kind of relative inflation, relatively constant inflation. We understand that our money today is worth somewhat less than it was in years previously. But the French franc had essentially retained its value largely unchanged from its introduction by Napoleon in 1803 to the First World War in 1914. Many French people hoped it would return to that stable currency, that stable franc it had been before the war. Poincaré kind of recognized that probably wasn't going to happen, but by fixing it to the gold standard, he hoped that it would maintain a level of consistency in its value that would end France's economic problems, and in the short term they did. And Poincaré was awarded when the National Bloc was government won another majority in the election of 1928. And it seemed, at least in the short term, that France's financial problems had been solved and perhaps an era of political stability under Poincaré and the National Bloc was about to emerge.